Easy guys, today I wanted to revisit the 2008 Maxis classic Spore, a live simulation, real-time strategy god game. After searching Google for Spore challenges, I found a Reddit post listing interesting ways to try and play Spore. At the top of the list was the Pitiful Worm challenge, using a creature with no limbs, level 1 sing and level 1 bite for the entirety of the game. So I wanted to see if I could add my own spin to this and have some fun with it. To ensure my pitiful worm would have the best chance for success, I turned to Google for guidance. Tell me, Google, what is the most successful worm? My Doom, the most damaging virus ever released. And so, it begins. Our destiny had been laid before us. We would conquer the Pitiful Worm challenge as My Doom, the most pitiful worm in the galaxy. We started life as herbivores, but how would we survive? What adversity would we face on our new home? The planet Doom. Like a breaking egg infested with parasites, My Doom was born. To begin this challenge properly, we first needed to eat enough small floating vegetation to unlock the ability to call a mate. Then, instead of evolving My Doom, we would devolve him by removing his eyes and tail. Despite earning 25 DNA points for selling off his default body parts, My Doom thought the whole situation was a rip-off. My Doom was now a pitiful worm. He was painfully slow without his tail as his meager physique tried to propel itself through the thick waters of the Tide Pool. His lack of eyes leaves most of the screen black, limiting his ability to find food or spot danger. Once that danger was upon him, he had little way of outrunning or outmaneuvering it. My Doom's only hope was that his pursuers would become distracted by something else before being able to finish him off. This wasn't My Doom's only problem. Competition for food in the Tide Pool was fierce. Even if he was lucky enough to find some food, he struggled to get near it before other species would rush in and take it from him with their superior speed. My Doom struggled for days against a barren tide pool of darkness and misery. With no food in sight, he swam, seemingly getting nowhere as his pathetic body struggled to make headway against the stronger water's flow. Sometimes it was easy to just go with the flow and let the tides push him around, hoping he might come across a morsel of food on the way. But instead of food, he found only more predators. He swam desperately as they leisurely eyed him up and rushed in for the kill. As he drifted for days, most of the vegetation he came across had already been stripped bare when he found it. Evolution had not been kind to My Doom. With little to no physical prowess to lean upon, My Doom's only chance of survival was his brain. It was here that My Doom hatched a cunning plan and called forth into the void for a mate. At this point, it's worth pointing out that My Doom was blind, largely deaf, and had no limbs, so dating was somewhat of a guessing game, but at least his standards were quite low. Instead of worrying about how attractive, loving, or kind his potential mate might be, he would instead be satisfied as long as she was alive. Although admittedly, he found it quite hard to tell, but there was little point in him worrying about being blind. He just couldn't see the point. It wasn't long before he bumped into his lifelong mate, called I Love You. Now, the challenge hadn't stipulated whether or not the pitiful worm should be a vegetarian or carnivorous, and so opportunity had presented itself, the single and only modification My Doom would ever make, his jaws. At this point, paleontologists often refer to this day as Day Zero, the day My Doom was truly born. Make no mistake, My Doom was still terribly slow, and whilst his jaws gave him some defenses as he parried the bites of other predators, they often only delayed the inevitable, unless he could somehow guide them into a distraction. To survive, My Doom plotted and schemed. He floated in the water's flow, waiting, until he came across other creatures caught in the tide with him and snapped them up. He tried eating his own kind, although Spore was too family-friendly for My Doom's depravity. He tested other creatures' defenses. If he could eat it, he would try. But it was no easy task, and it was all too easy to get stuck between a pair of predatory Goliaths and become smashed into oblivion. But he would try and try again. For his next trick, instead of trying to chase other creatures, which often proved futile, he would lure them to him instead. He hung around chunks of vegetation, pouncing on vegetarians too blind with hunger to notice him in the shadows. Then he tried wearing a piece of vegetation as a hat, luring any poor vegetarian straight into his deadly trap. Finally, after much hardship, cunning, and coming up with devious plans, something amazing happened, and his brain grew. The challenge stipulated that we could not add any limbs to our worm, so we would have to begin the creature stage without them. Mydoom slithered his worthless torso onto the beach, along with some other members of his kin who had been inspired by his feats of strength. Nature had not intended Mydoom to come this far, yet against all odds, he had. His enthusiasm was short-lived. Life on land was little better than it was in water. His woeful eyesight left the world a dismal plethora of grey and black. He saw no beauty in this world, only darkness. He began to explore until he fell into a pile of sticks. It was a freep nest. The locals had never seen such a pathetic creature before. They considered stepping on Mydoom, but it would have made the nest dirty. The freep immediately started singing songs about Mydoom. Their efforts were largely wasted, of course, as Mydoom was largely deaf. It was difficult for Mydoom to come to terms with at times. The news was hard to hear. But, alas, he made his best efforts to return the merry gesture. He blew as hard as he could from between his jaws. Nevertheless, it made the freep laugh out loud. Mydoom had made a friend. This was the first positive reaction he had ever had with another creature. To him, other creatures could never be trusted. They either stole from him or hunted him for food. These were the first times Mydoom had ever known friendship. Yet he had forgotten an important truth, a decision he had made back in the Tidal Pool. He was a carnivore, and he was getting hungry. So Mydoom had a bright idea. He needed to do what every successful worm virus before him had learnt to do: self-replicate and propagate. One feeble worm was just an idea, yet several were a clue. He headed for home, or at least he thought he was. Sometimes it was difficult to tell. He made a rousing speech to the other worms of doom, a plan to bring order and efficiency to the world. Fate had not made the worms for friendship. They must either starve or conquer. The other worms agreed. In truth, they couldn't hear what he was saying, but the word friendship sounded nice, so they started bouncing enthusiastically. Starving, the worms set out until they found the Juco. Hunting was difficult, blind as they were, and Mydoom had to be careful. If the Juco all jumped in at once, the doomworms could soon be overpowered. Instead, Mydoom used his cunning once more. He singled out a target, separating them from the group and driving them into the ocean. Unable to swim, the Juco were pinned and succumbed to their fate, and the worms fed. It was the same for the Yanips. The worms rushed into their nest, driving them apart, and cornered a stray caught in the confusion, allowing them to feed. Whilst the worms had some success, this often wasn't the case. The worms tried to ambush the Curly, but found them too fast and agile for the worms to pursue. Then they were jumped by the Brawgle, and with only level 1 bite, poor speed and maneuverability, an ambush could often mean a death sentence for the worms. Mydoom fled as fast as his pitiful body could carry him, but the rest of his team were lost. Ultimately, even Mydoom succumbed to the very creatures he sought for food. Mydoom arrived back at the nest, eager to recruit more worms to his team. To his confusion, all his worm kind ran away. Mydoom set out in pursuit. "Wait," he cried, "I need more for the cause." His kind ignored him, mainly because they were deaf, but secondarily because their planet was being pummeled by meteors. Curse my eyes and ears, Mydoom thought. Once the apocalypse had subsided and his numbers renewed, Mydoom ventured out into the wilderness. They heard a terrifying roar. It was McAfee, and it looked like he was suffering from a terrible case of hemorrhoids, making him extra grumpy. He had heard of the worms' antics, multiplying themselves and cleaning out other species, and was trying to scan them out and quarantine them to his stomach. Mydoom had to be vigilant to avoid him at all costs. If only he could see him coming. The following days were a challenge. The more he used his wit and cunning to ambush and separate creatures from their group, the more his brain grew. But for every success, the worms were frequently overwhelmed. Other creatures had flight, armor, and powerful claws, and the worms had nothing but their numbers. They were even pursued by an alien spacecraft as it abducted creatures around him left and right, although, in honesty, it could have been a pigeon. He wasn't sure. Returning to the nest once more, two things dawned on Mydoom. One, how the hell was his partner I Love You laying all these massive eggs in their nest? They were bigger than he was, and she was so slender. I Love You nodded slyly. Two, they needed more than brains to survive. Spotting a branch on the floor, Mydoom grabbed it in his primitive jaws and slammed it on the ground. He had a plan. He gathered his fellow worms and explained what it was. They would master simple tools, build a village and forge weapons. No longer would the worms be limited by their fragile bodies. The worms set up their village and sent scouting parties to hunt creatures for food. No longer would their inadequately evolved physique hold them back. Mydoom even domesticated a beetle, a species that Mydoom had learned much about. Their leader, Paul McCartney, was wealthy and sang magnificent music, which excited Mydoom, although he wondered why they were called the Beatles when they seemed to have 8 legs. Apparently, the front pair were mandibles, not legs, but Mydoom couldn't see anyway, so he gave up thinking about it. Next, Mydoom taught his worm kind to use hatchets, perfect against prey and enemy tribes. It was a wise move, as it wasn't long before a pink tribe of beetles had evolved. Unwilling to be the victim once more, Mydoom planned to strike first, before this newly built village could be a problem. Mydoom gathered his entire tribe. Armed with hatchets, the worms set to work on the beetles first, and once their defences were crippled, he smashed their hut to the ground, destroying the pink tribe. In that short space of time, 3 new tribes had appeared, and it was unlikely any of them would be friendly. Mydoom set about raising some new worms he had lost in the raid against the pink tribe. Pleasantly, one of the new young wormlings told Mydoom that their pet beetle had taught them a beautiful song and asked if Mydoom would like to hear it. Mydoom replied yes in excitement. So would I, the youngling replied. Frustratingly, being deaf wasn't the worm's only problem. A Grox battleship had turned up, which immediately abducted Mydoom's pet beetle. A great conflict between Paul McCartney's Beatles and the Grox was taking place at the galaxy's centre, and the Grox were taking samples of the beetle species for research. Angry that the Grox had stolen his jukebox, he prepared to tame another beetle. Just as Mydoom returned with his replacement, the horn blared over the village. Raiders had been spotted. It was the Lilac tribe, upset about this clue of disgusting worms that had destroyed the pinks on their doorstep. Despite having no limbs, eyes or evolved parts or armor, the worms had mastered the art of the hatchet, and the small lavender raiding group met its match. Realizing that the list of enemy tribes on his doorstep was growing, Mydoom launched an immediate counter-offensive on the Lavender village, knowing that their recent failed attack would diminish their numbers for a short while, leaving them vulnerable. The worms had a small window to attack. The tribe didn't get halfway towards the Lavender's village before the Green tribe sent their own raiding party to Mydoom's village. The worms returned to base just in time to counter the Green village's attack. That was close. Surely the Green village would be weakened after this. Mydoom immediately sent a counter-raid into the Green village. The journey there was hard. Some of the primitives in the undergrowth disliked all the worms wriggling around in the bushes and started stamping on them. This delayed Mydoom and his worms, giving the Greens a chance to replenish their forces. By the time Mydoom arrived, the Greens were at full strength and the battle roared on for hours. But despite their best efforts, the worms were pushed back. Mydoom's tribe had been severely weakened. Almost everyone had died. Mydoom needed to replenish his tribe's numbers quickly, but they were out of food. Despite the worm's best efforts to provide I Love You with as much food as possible, she had only produced a few eggs before the Lavender tribe sent another raid into the village. But with only 3 worms to defend the base, it would be touch and go. Luckily, it was only a small warband of 3 Lavender beetles. The tribes were evenly matched, and the Doom worms held their own. Mydoom desperately needed more food, but it wasn't long before the Green tribe attacked. The heroic worms held out, raid after raid. Hardened by all the years of discrimination in the Tidal Pool, the worms had an iron will and an ungodly determination. Unfortunately, Mydoom's second pet beetle was slain in battle. With a population to grow and feed, you may wonder if this tale of Mydoom, the most successful email worm in history, involved a fishing scam, and indeed it did. Tired of hunting the primitive bush animals for scraps, Mydoom was amazed at how easy it was to dangle a hook into the water and get hordes of mindless fish to give up their lives. Our tribe was a master at this, probably because the worms already looked like bait, giving them an unfair evolutionary advantage. With his new abundant food supply, Mydoom doubled down on harvesting as much fish as they could carry. Mydoom knew that if he was to send out another raiding party, he needed the food to replenish his forces instantly so as not to leave him vulnerable again. But it wasn't long before the Lilacs raided our worms again. After defeating them, Mydoom drove home a vicious counter-offensive. The battle went well. The Doomworms got the upper hand on the Lilac villagers. Suddenly, the raid horn sounded back at Doom Village. The Greens were on their way to attack. Not again. Frustratingly, there was only Mydoom left at home to defend their village. But if the rest of the worms left the lilacs now, the enemy would have the opportunity to replenish their numbers. My Doom couldn't let that happen and ordered the rest of the Doom worms to keep attacking the lilacs' hut, knowing full well if the greens destroyed their own, it would be game over for their species. This left My Doom to face the green raid head-on, alone. Summoning all his determination from the tide pool, he raised his war hatchet to the sky and wheezed out a pathetic war cry, and collided with the raiding party. Meanwhile, the rest of the Doomworms had destroyed the Lilacs' village hut, but My Doom had been critically injured in the Greens' raid, leaving the Greens free to destroy their home. The worms slithered as fast as their meager bodies could carry them back to Doom Village. The tribe arrived just in the nick of time to save the village, but only just. My Doom was hailed as a hero from that moment on, and with their abundant food supply from their new fishing scam, the worms quickly replenished their numbers and sent a raid deep into Green territory. When they got there, the Greens had little food left and only a few villagers to defend themselves. My Doom soon overpowered them. The next foe the worms faced was the Orange Chloroblast tribe. They were much more heavily armed and dangerous, their weapons more varied and diverse than our own worms' simple hatchets, and many worms were lost in the raids that followed, but their vast food reserves prevailed. Despite losing the first raid, My Doom was immediately able to send another wave into the Orange Village, and the enemy's defences crumbled. In the end, all that was left was the Cyans. The Cyan beetles had remained neutral to the worms since the beginning, and the chieftain even waved a cheery hello when the worms passed by. Sadly for My Doom, his survival thus far had led to many choices and atrocities that had turned his heart cold. Every non-worm he knew had turned on him, and those that hadn't, like his beloved pet beetle, had been abducted or slain. Twice, the only way he knew to keep his people safe was to conquer. With that, the worms destroyed the Cyan's village, wiping their species from the planet Doom, leaving only worms to fight for what remained. To rally his people, My Doom created Doom Tower in their own image, a towering example of their pitiful physique worn as a badge of pride. Their Doom tanks represented wheeled death incarnate in their own image. Not all worms agreed on how to develop their planet. Some welcomed diversity in religion, others were unsure how to utilize the spice their planet created in abundance, and quarrels began to arise. My Doom chose to secure as many spice veins as possible before the other worm factions could take a foothold. His Doom tanks were swift and got to work securing the veins. The extra spice reserves increased his wealth so it could be spent bolstering the economy and his military. The first rival faction was the Yellows. The Yellows tried their best to defend themselves, but My Doom had been fast and decisive in controlling the spice, and his economy far outstripped their own. Soon their city was his to command. At this stage, My Doom was already the dominant force on the continent. Other factions such as the Purples and Reds surrendered shortly after. Next, My Doom developed his aircraft. Many say that My Doom was inherently wicked and evil, but it wasn't true. My Doom made many attempts to negotiate with his own kind. He just had questionable people skills. The Cyans and the Greens both refused his attempts to broker peace, and so they fell to his wrath. The Blues on the other side of the continent had constructed some kind of worm religion and attempted to convert non-believers. My Doom blocked this, and they were cancelled. For My Doom, peace was achieved through order. Trivial pursuits like diversity only led to conflict. Those that challenged this were dealt with. Religion to him was just another reason to argue. With his final act, My Doom bombarded the Blue City with terrible weapons of mass destruction, launching ICBM missiles across the continent. This was the worm's judgment day. Out of the ashes, Doom Tower stood unwavering, uniting all the worms of Doom towards a shared goal: space. The final evolution of the worm design language is not dissimilar to a Grok's design. My Doom had come a long way since his days as a pitiful worm in the tide pool. As such, our challenge came to an end. How would the worms prosper in space is yet to be seen, as their battle for the galaxy was about to begin.